A few years ago, my girlfriend, Hannah, and I decided to celebrate our anniversary by taking a weekend camping trip. We were both avid hikers and loved the idea of escaping the city for a couple of days. We chose Raven Ridge, a dense forest about 4 hours from where we lived. It was known for its remote trails and stunning views, and the thought of spending a weekend completely unplugged was appealing. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already low in the sky. The parking lot was nearly empty, which was exactly what we had hoped for. We strapped on our packs and set off down the main trail, the sounds of the forest welcoming us with rustling leaves and distant birdsong. After about an hour of hiking, we found a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. The ground was soft and mossy, and a narrow stream trickled nearby. It was perfect. We pitched our tent, gathered some firewood, and started preparing dinner. The evening was calm, the kind that makes you forget all your worries. As the sun set, the forest grew quieter. By the time we finished eating, the only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful but also a little unnerving, like the woods were holding their breath. "Did you hear that?" Hannah asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. I froze, listening. For a moment, there was nothing, and then I heard it, a faint, high-pitched sound, almost like someone whispering. It was coming from the direction of the trees. "It's probably the wind," I said, trying to sound confident. "Or maybe an animal." Hannah nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. We decided to call it a night, crawling into the tent and zipping ourselves in tight. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the steady rhythm of the stream, but my dreams were restless. I kept hearing whispers, faint and unintelligible, like a conversation just out of earshot. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. The whispers were louder now, clearer. I turned to Hannah, but she was still asleep. The sound seemed to be coming from outside the tent. I unzipped the door as quietly as I could and peeked out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows across the clearing. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, I saw movement. A figure was standing in the trees, watching us. It was hard to make out any details in the darkness, but it was tall and thin, its posture unnaturally stiff. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the shadows. But then it moved, stepping closer to the clearing. I ducked back into the tent, my heart racing. I shook Hannah awake, whispering, "There's someone out there." She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What are you talking about?" "There's someone in the trees," I said, my voice trembling. She grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the woods. The figure was gone. "You're imagining things," she said, but her voice was tense. "Let's just go back to sleep." Reluctantly, I agreed. But I didn't sleep. I lay there, listening to the whispers, until they finally faded into the distance. The next morning, we decided to pack up and head to a different spot. I didn't tell Hannah, but I found footprints near the edge of the clearing, large and deep, like someone had been standing there for a long time. They led into the woods but disappeared after a few yards. We hiked for hours, eventually finding another campsite near a rocky outcrop. The spot felt safer, more open, and we spent the afternoon exploring the area. By evening, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the figure. But as the sun set, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, closer. Hannah heard them too, her face pale as she looked around the campsite. "What is that?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, gripping the hatchet we had brought for firewood. The sound seemed to come from all around us, like the forest itself was speaking. It wasn't just one voice, it was dozens, overlapping and impossible to understand. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The figure was back. It stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. This time, I could see more of it. Its limbs were impossibly long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on us. "Hannah," I whispered, "get in the tent." "Now." She didn't argue. We scrambled inside, zipping it shut as the whispers grew louder. The figure didn't follow, but its presence was suffocating. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I didn't know where to go. At some point, the whispers stopped. The silence was almost worse. We stayed in the tent until dawn, too afraid to move. When we finally emerged, the figure was gone, but the clearing felt wrong, like the air itself was heavier. We decided to leave the forest altogether, abandoning most of our gear. As we hiked back to the trailhead, the feeling of being watched never left. Every now and then, I would catch glimpses of movement in the trees, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. When we reached the car, we didn't speak. We just got in and drove, leaving the forest behind. A few days later, I was unpacking what little gear we had brought back when I found something that didn't belong. Inside my backpack was a small bundle of twigs, tied together with a piece of red string. I didn't put it there, and neither did Hannah. I threw it away, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. Faint and distant, like they're calling me back to the woods. And I know, deep down, that they're waiting. Last summer, my friends and I decided to go on a camping trip in a state park we'd never visited before. It was one of those spontaneous plans, a way to escape our phones, get some fresh air, and bond over beers and campfire stories. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Ryan, his girlfriend Kate, and our other friends Jason and Emily. We chose Red Ridge State Park, a sprawling area with dense forests, rolling hills, and miles of trails. The place had a reputation for being a bit rugged, but that was part of the appeal. We wanted something remote, somewhere we wouldn't run into other campers. The hike to our campsite was uneventful, just the sound of birds and the crunch of leaves underfoot. We set up camp near a small lake, the water still and dark, reflecting the towering pines that surrounded it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we lit a fire and settled in for the night. It wasn't until later, as we sat swapping ghost stories, that things started to feel off. "I heard this place is haunted," Jason said, grinning as he poked the fire with a stick. "Something about hikers disappearing and weird lights in the woods." Kate rolled her eyes. "Every forest has those stories. It's just people getting lost." "Still," Ryan said, his tone playful, "wouldn't it be creepy if we saw something tonight?" We all laughed, but the mood had shifted. The darkness seemed deeper, the woods quieter. Around midnight I needed to use the bathroom. I grabbed my flashlight and walked a short distance into the trees, far enough to have some privacy. The beam of my light cut through the darkness, illuminating the gnarled roots and underbrush. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a faint, flickering glow in the distance. But as I squinted, I realized it was real. It was pale and bluish, like a lantern floating just above the ground. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The light didn't move, didn't flicker. It just hovered there, faint but steady. I felt a strange pull, like it was calling to me, and before I realized it, I was walking toward it. The farther I walked, the harder it became to orient myself. The trees grew denser, their branches clawing at my clothes, and the ground became uneven, littered with sharp rocks and tangled roots. The light stayed the same distance ahead, never closer, never farther. Finally I stopped, shaking myself out of the strange trance. I turned to head back but froze. I didn't recognize anything. The campsite was gone. The trees around me looked different, their trunks gnarled and twisted like something out of a nightmare. The air was colder, and the silence was absolute. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, nothing. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting through the trees. The light was gone. I tried not to panic. I told myself I just needed to retrace my steps, but every path I took seemed to lead me deeper into the woods. The trees felt closer, their branches tangling above me, blocking out what little moonlight there was. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps crunching through the underbrush. My heart pounded as I swung the flashlight around, but I saw nothing. "Ryan? Jason?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Is that you?" No response. The footsteps stopped. I kept walking, trying to stay calm, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shadows darting between the trees, flashes of movement that disappeared when I turned to look. Then I saw the light again. It was closer this time, brighter. I hesitated, torn between the instinct to run and the irrational pull to follow it. Against my better judgment, I stepped toward it, one slow step at a time. As I approached, the light began to change. It flickered, growing brighter and dimmer, almost like it was breathing. And then, just as I reached the edge of the clearing, it vanished. In its place was a figure. It stood in the center of the clearing, tall and gaunt, its features obscured by shadow. It wasn't human, its limbs were too long, its movements too jerky. It tilted its head, as if studying me, and I realized it was holding something. A lantern. The same bluish glow I had been following was now in its hands, flickering like a dying flame. The figure stepped closer, and I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Stay away!" I shouted, my voice breaking. The figure stopped, tilting its head again. For a moment, the forest was silent. And then it smiled. The smile was unnatural, stretching far too wide, revealing rows of sharp, glinting teeth. It raised the lantern higher, and the glow spread, illuminating the clearing. The ground was littered with bones, animal, human, I couldn't tell. The sight made my stomach churn. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just desperate to get away. The footsteps followed, faster and heavier, echoing through the trees. The glow of the lantern flickered behind me, casting long, twisting shadows. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I tripped, my flashlight flying out of my hand. I scrambled to my feet, expecting the figure to be right behind me, but the forest was empty. The light was gone. The footsteps had stopped. I stumbled forward, my legs trembling, until I saw something familiar, the faint glow of our campfire through the trees. Relief washed over me as I burst into the clearing, collapsing next to the fire. Ryan, Jason, Kate, and Emily were sitting around the fire, their faces pale. "Where were you?" Ryan asked, his voice tight with fear. "We've been looking for you for hours." I tried to explain, but my words came out jumbled. Finally, I just said, "We need to leave." Now. They didn't argue. We packed up what we could carry and hiked back to the trailhead, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the trees as we reached the car. I never told them about the figure. I didn't need to. The silence in the car, the way we all avoided looking at each other, it was enough to know they felt it too. I haven't been back to Redridge since. But sometimes, late at night, I see that light in my dreams, flickering just beyond the trees. And I know it's still out there, waiting. Last spring, I decided to take a solo camping trip to clear my head. It had been a tough few months at work, long hours, endless meetings, and a mounting pile of unfinished tasks. I felt like I was suffocating. A weekend in the woods seemed like the perfect escape. I picked a spot about 3 hours north called Pine Hollow Forest. It wasn't a tourist destination, just a sprawling expanse of woods with unmarked trails, perfect for solitude. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping low in the sky. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze was soothing. I strapped on my pack and set off along the narrow trail. The forest was dense, the trees towering above like cathedral spires, and soon the world outside the woods felt a million miles away. After about an hour of hiking, I came across a small clearing beside a shallow stream. The ground was mossy and soft, and the gentle sound of trickling water made it feel serene. It was exactly what I had been looking for. I pitched my tent near the edge of the clearing, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire as the last light of the day faded. As the fire crackled, I sat in my camp chair, watching the flames dance and sipping a cup of instant coffee. The night was calm, but the silence was almost too deep. I had camped before, and there were always the sounds of nocturnal animals, insects, or distant owls. But here, there was nothing, just an oppressive stillness that felt like it was pressing against my ears. That's when I noticed it. through the trees, maybe 50 yards away, I could just make out another clearing. It wasn't the one I was camped in. This one was perfectly circular, almost unnaturally so. The grass inside was short and uniform, like someone had deliberately trimmed it. And in the center stood a single, gnarled tree, its branches bare despite the season. I stared at it, an uneasy feeling creeping over me. Something about the clearing felt wrong. The way the grass was cut, the barren tree, it didn't belong. But I shook off the thought, telling myself I was just overthinking things. The woods were full of strange sights, and not everything had an explanation. I turned back to the fire and tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, soft, rhythmic tapping, like tree branches brushing against each other. But as I lay there, holding my breath, I realized it wasn't random. It was deliberate. A steady tap, 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 coming from the direction of the other clearing. I sat up, my heart pounding. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows against the tent walls. I unzipped the door and stepped into the cold night air. The moon was bright, illuminating the clearing in a pale, ghostly light. I scanned the trees with my flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the forest was completely silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, just a suffocating stillness. I shone my flashlight toward the distant clearing, but I couldn't see anything unusual. Still, the unease clung to me like a second skin. I forced myself back into the tent, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. Every creak of the trees, every faint rustle sent my heart racing. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I decided to investigate. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the other clearing. The unease grew stronger with each step, like a weight pressing on my chest. When I finally reached it, I stopped dead in my tracks. The clearing was even stranger up close. The grass was impossibly short, almost as if it had been trimmed with scissors, and the lone tree in the center looked ancient. Its bark was twisted and knotted, and its branches reached out like skeletal fingers. At the base of the tree was a circle of stones, arranged with perfect precision. Inside the circle were small, carved wooden figures, animals, people, and shapes I couldn't identify. Some of them were charred, as if they had been burned in a fire. The air around the clearing was heavy, almost suffocating, and the silence was absolute. I took a step closer, my eyes fixed on the carvings. Each one seemed to radiate something, an aura of unease, of something deeply wrong. My skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I didn't touch anything. I didn't even stay long. Something about the place felt sacred but malevolent, as if I was trespassing on something I didn't understand. I hurried back to my camp, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every step. When I reached my campsite, I froze. The fire pit I had built was scattered, the stones tossed haphazardly around the clearing. My tent had been unzipped, the flap hanging open like a gaping mouth. And in the center of the clearing, where I had been sitting the night before, was a single wooden figure. It was a crude carving of a man, its surface blackened by fire. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. The forest felt different now, hostile. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the trees felt like a warning. I slung my pack over my shoulder and started back toward the trailhead, my eyes darting to every shadow. The hike back felt endless. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches tangling above like a net. I tried to stay calm, to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, but the unease never left. When I finally reached the trailhead, I thought I was safe. But then I saw it. In the center of the path, blocking my way, was another wooden figure. It was larger this time, more detailed. Its face was twisted into a grotesque grin, and its charred surface seemed to radiate heat. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to throw it into the woods, to destroy it, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Instead, I stepped around it, my pulse racing, and practically ran to my car. For weeks after that trip, I felt like I was being followed. I started hearing tapping on my apartment walls at night, faint and rhythmic, just like in the forest. Sometimes, when I walked into a room, I would find small wooden carvings sitting on my shelves, though I never brought any back with me. I moved across the country a few months later, leaving no forwarding address. But even now, sometimes, late at night, I hear it, the tapping. Slow, deliberate. And I know the clearing hasn't forgotten me.